Welcome to our sixth webinar in a series focusing on welcoming and supporting newly arrived pupils who have been displaced. On this occasion, we have the pleasure to welcome expert speakers from Refugee Education UK. In today's webinar, we will focus on Afghan children and young people, their families, and the role of schools and the wider community in welcoming them and creating a supportive environment as they settle into a new life in the UK, in our education system, and the specific school setting. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of this webinar. First, Katie will speak for about 40 minutes. After that, she, together with her colleagues, Hamid and Ehsan, will take any questions that you may have. Feel free to use the Q&A box to send any questions as they come to you. In other words, you don't need to wait until the end. If you're listening to Katie's presentation and something, comes up that you want to ask, please type it there and then, because I will be collecting them and posing them to Katie, Hamid, and Ehsan after their presentation. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from us with a link to access a video recording of this webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Katie Barringer and Hamid Khan from Refugee Education UK. Katie leads Refugee Education UK's educational progression programme, which equips young asylum seekers and refugees with the advice, information, guidance and support they need to access education in the UK at all stages of their education journeys, from primary and secondary school to further and higher education. Since joining REUK 7 years ago, Katie has also overseen the expansion of its mentoring program from a London-based service to a project operating across 4 other cities and taken a lead on the development and delivery of REUK's training for those supporting and promoting refugee education. Her role at REUK builds on her previous career in senior management in UK prisons, followed by work in Asia with gang members recovering from drug addiction. Later, Hamid will join us. He's originally from Afghanistan, is Education Welcome Project Officer at Refugee Education UK, and he provides practical, logistical, administrative support to the project, which extends REUK's educational support to hundreds of newly arrived refugees. Before joining REUK, Hamid worked in business development for a range of organizations. Hamid joined REUK with a deep understanding of how the organization has grown, having first met REUK as an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child some years ago. Since then, he has served as REUK's longest-serving chair of the Youth Advisory Board. He graduated from the University of Brighton with a degree in aeronautical engineering, and Hamid believes in equality and diversity, especially when it comes to the education rights of young people displaced by conflict. Enough about me, over to you, Katie. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Silvana. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you who are taking part as well. So before we start, I am going to share my slides. Okay, brilliant. So as Silvana has kindly introduced me, I'm Katie. I'm the Head of Educational Progression at REUK. And I'm here with my colleague Hamid. And I'm also here with my other colleague Ehsan. And we are so fortunate at REUK to have 2 colleagues who are themselves Afghan nationals. And I will be doing the presentation today, but Hamid and Ehsan are very much here to answer your questions. And I think they both bring with them a huge depth of experience and quite different experience. So as Silvana has already mentioned, Hamid came to the UK in his teens as an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child, went through the further education system, and Hamid, I think I'm right in saying, didn't have an enormous amount of education in Afghanistan, but went through the FE system in the UK, went to university, has graduated from university, and is now a very valued colleague of us. Whereas Ehsan went to university in Afghanistan, worked for the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan, and he and his family fled Afghanistan when the Taliban took over in the summer. So he has different experience and a real breadth of experience as well. So anyway, without further ado, we're running this training today because over the years, we've built up a lot of Afghanistan-specific experience, including supporting Afghan refugees in the UK. We've run a monitoring project in Kabul itself, analysing outcomes for returned young people. And we've been commissioned by the UN to undertake research specifically on the links between education and integration for young Afghan refugees. Today, we don't have that much time. We really could have designed a sort of 6-week training course. But we know how stretched teachers are, and we wanted to provide the essentials to as many people as possible. So what we're going to do is go through a brief overview of children and families' likely previous experiences, both of displacement and of education. Then we'll look at the most common. Sorry, I'm just trying to move on with my slides, and for some reason they're not moving on. Why might that be? Excuse me. There we go. Then we'll look at the most common educational challenges faced by refugee children and key strategies that you as teachers can implement to support their education. And at the end, we're going to point you in the direction of additional support that's available, both from us and from others. So, outcome 1, let's look at the impact of pupils' prior experience and their forced displacement and education. Rapid resettlement is the backdrop and context to everything we're talking about today. We're not going to go into this in much detail, but it's worth mentioning that resettlement is normally a very, very carefully planned process. And what families who have been resettled from Afghanistan in the past year have experienced is very different to other resettlement programs. It's an intensely accelerated process with a much shorter time frame. Operation Pitting, which was the British military's operation to evacuate both British nationals and Afghans from Kabul. There are about 15,000 people who were evacuated as part of that, and subsequently about 5,000 have joined through the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, the ACRS. So what's different about this? No pre-departure support. So if we cast our minds back, I'm sure we all remember the chaotic and distressing scenes at the airport, which led to many families arriving with acute psychosocial and health needs, including even bullet wounds in some cases. They would arrive typically with just the clothes they were wearing, a small bag. So these are people whose lives have been devastatingly and dramatically uprooted. And then what did they arrive to? So bridging hotels for the most part, and most recently there are still about 10,000 people who are still in hotels. Offers from local authorities of permanent accommodation are definitely coming in, but there's a huge gap between what has been secured and what's needed. And particularly because many Afghan families are quite large, so an average maybe of 8 members of a family, it's very difficult for local authorities sometimes to find adequate housing. And then there are very large numbers of young children among that. So about 40% of the children coming would be preschool, about 50% are primary school, and about only 10% are secondary school. So what's next? So the government's looking at a huge range of scenarios, from remaining in bridging hotels, some movement between hotels, the possibility of consolidation and clusters of support, and then of course some families, if they're able to, are making their own private arrangements. So what this means for schools is that there are a lot of unknowns and that pupil movement is likely to be quite high. Now in a bit we're going to think about the impact of all of this on education. But in order to do that, we're going to need to go back a little bit and draw out some relevant points for education in Afghanistan, even before the events of last summer. So firstly, to give you an overview of education in Afghanistan, available UNICEF stats, and this is from 2015, show that attendance and completion rates were relatively low, and starkly so when you get to secondary school level. The attendance rates in this table represent attendance and completion rates for boys and girls, but it's worth noting that the rates are consistently lower for girls due to gender norms and expectations that many girls won't continue their education as they reach adolescence. So these are the statistics, but what is it worth keeping in mind? What are the key features of Afghanistan's education system? So we spoke to some young Afghans, and although they're not able to be with you here today, I'd really encourage you to listen to the voices of the young Afghans themselves. And we have recorded one of our young people that we work with, a girl called Salma, who is now studying at university. And this is what she wanted you to know.
Hello everyone, my name is Salma Majid. I'm from Afghanistan, a city called Paktia. My first language is Pashto. I came to the UK in 2014. I did my year 10, year 11 in college, and now I'm at university level studying biomedical science. So hooray, I made it up to here. Because I remember when I came to the UK with no clue how things work here. I was so shy, I was so scared, nervous to speak up. What should I say? I was so even scared if I speak a word, people would laugh on me about my pronunciation, about what I say. So yeah, students, that's the first clue I've just given. So children would be more shy. They would have very low self-esteem within themselves. But I can tell you a secret that Afghanistan children are much stronger, much smarter and clever inside them. It just takes them a little bit of time to speak up and come up with what treasures they have inside them. So it is really important to give a little bit of extra time to Afghan children to allow them to speak up what they are doing. I think mostly they know within themselves what they are doing, but it will take a little bit of time. So giving them more time, the time difference, maybe some students say, oh, why we are a whole day or half day in schools, because in Afghanistan school, the lack of schools building, they have made like 2 or 3 rounds for children to come to school. So one group would be in school education like for 3 or 4 hours, whereas so they can equalize to every single people to go to education. But in here, the schools are compulsory, and from 7 to 8 hours over there, it's literally not compulsory at all. As an Afghan refugee, I had a lot of trouble, but with the help of my teachers, I'm here. So yeah, helping children, listening to them, giving them more time and more activities to know them more better. I think they are more talented and more clever inside them. So it's going to take them time to show their own talents. And with your confidence and with your help and support, they will show up. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Salma. Her advice is so helpful, and I really hope that her story will also encourage you of the remarkable educational strides that Afghan refugees are able to make in really a few short years. But building on what Salma has said, I want to draw out 3 key features for you to bear in mind.
Oh, hello everyone, sorry. My name is Salma. I'm from Afghanistan.
There we go. Apologies. So in Afghan state schools, classes would most likely be separated by sex. Boys would go to school at certain times and then girls at different times. So be aware that girls and boys may not be as comfortable with sitting in a classroom with mixed sex. School days in Afghanistan would be around half a day, so that the schools could accommodate the needs to separate by gender. And children may not be used to attending a full day of school, although it's worth noting that children that were educated privately would have had different experiences. The other thing to sort of draw out is that teaching and learning styles are likely to be very different in the UK and in Afghanistan. So generally in Afghanistan, there's a much more rote or memory focused teaching and learning style that is very much driven by the teacher. So it would not be traditionally acceptable to challenge or question what a teacher says. And while children will quickly adjust to a more interactive, explorative learning style, at first this will be very unfamiliar to them, and they will probably be hesitant to participate fully, even if their English is good. So do please bear in mind that a lack of participation does not mean a lack of knowledge or intelligence. So these are the kind of salient features of education in Afghanistan that it's important for you to be aware of as a backdrop, I suppose. But moving on now to Outcome 2, which is developing an understanding of the academic and well-being challenges for resettled Afghan children. So first, we've divided these challenges into academic and well-being challenges. Things that are concretely about children's learning, and then the well-being challenges. But of course, we do want to acknowledge and to stress that those two areas overlap and interact and can never be fully separated. But I think it's possibly a useful way of clustering these things. So in looking at the well-being challenges, we're going to look briefly at what has happened and what is happening, the common causes of poor emotional and psychosocial well-being in resettled children. So let's look at this table. So when you look at the table on the left, the 4 key things that Afghan refugee children are likely to have experienced. So as we followed the news from Afghanistan last summer, I'm sure we all saw those distressing scenes, but it's probably important to bear in mind that for many Afghan people, they have lived through decades of conflict and hardship. It's not just the events of last summer. But as a sort of corrective to this, I'd also want to highlight that when we work with these young people, what we see again and again is a remarkable resilience, determination, and sense of hope. So whilst we're talking about the challenges now, I don't want that sort of resilience to be forgotten. So there's the trauma and distress of the past, but I think also of the present. They have suddenly arrived in an unfamiliar country, being confined to a hotel, of often little or no indication of when they'll be able to really restart rebuilding their lives. And that's immensely destabilizing and has been described as an additional trauma. And I think the issue here of sort of expectation and reality comes in. Like almost all resettled refugees, Afghans had no idea of what it meant to come to the UK, but probably they didn't expect to be confined to a hotel room for what has now been a year. In addition, they're grieving for what they've lost. So what they've had to often quite abruptly give up for the country they've lost. They're anxious about others who remain stuck in Afghanistan and will quite often feel powerless to help the people they love. And so finally, our research shows that it's really not uncommon for refugee children to feel isolated, lonely. They may feel like they've got no friends, and in the worst case, they might genuinely be experiencing bullying. Now, this can, of course, be linked to language barriers, finding it hard to communicate and settle in to those around them. But I think it's also to do with even a child who speaks relatively good English, adapting to a new culture, a new country, a new environment may also do this. So then moving on to the right-hand side of this table. And these are the behaviours you may see. So of course, you're not seeing what's happened on the left, but what you may see is, for example, the fight, flight or fight mechanism, which I'm sure you've all heard of. So when children witness serious violence or have experienced trauma, the fight and flight response in their brains is very, very easily reactivated by things that for you or I may seem insignificant. So when this happens, the sympathetic nervous system acts like a sort of gas pedal, flooding the body with adrenaline, raising the heart rate and switching off the thinking part of the brain, putting all of the physical senses on high alert. So when this happens, firstly, it is impossible to learn in that sort of highly stimulated sort of way of being. But also you may well see extreme behaviour in the classroom. They may suddenly become angry or hit or push another child, or they may sort of internalise that and complain about a physical pain in their body. But then for other children, the flight part of the same mechanism will lead them to withdraw, sort of disconnect, zone out. And what you may experience is a child who absolutely does not want to interact with others at all. Now, these may, in practice, seem like completely opposite responses, but they actually come from the same hormonal response in the child. So these well-being challenges may also lead to reduced concentration and focus in the classroom. You may find them more easily startled, distracted. They may find certain noises or situations triggering. The other thing to sort of draw out is that many of the refugee children and young people we work with complain that they're finding it very, very difficult to sleep, real problems with insomnia. And so what you will see is tiredness, falling asleep, maybe coming late in the mornings, really sort of impacting their ability to concentrate in the school day. And then, of course, you may also see visible distress, something that's triggered the child and they come very visibly upset in the classroom or maybe in the playground. So we've talked about trauma and psychosocial wellbeing under the wellbeing category, but it's of course important to remember that mental health challenges impact every aspect of children's ability to engage in education and learning. So drawing on our research and experience, we're going to look now at the academic challenges that are very visible in the classroom, and of course the challenges to learning outside the classroom where they may be a little less visible. So in the classroom, I think probably the most obvious challenge faced by refugee children is the language barrier. And in many schools, insufficient EAL support to meet this need. And I think this is particularly, I know a lot of schools are finding that they're particularly under-resourced in this area since the funding model for EAL changed a few years ago. We mentioned earlier that styles of teaching in Afghanistan are very different to the UK, and the children are expending energy adjusting and adapting to a new curriculum and a new teaching style and learning style, which means they may have less energy left for learning and need support. And then, of course, as with any population of children, there'll be a number of children who have special educational needs and disabilities, but these can potentially be much, much harder to diagnose and address with children with English as an additional language, and then compounded by the trauma they may have been through. Turning now to the things that may affect academic outcomes outside of the classroom. For the thousands of children who are still in those bridging hotels, there is nothing like an appropriate environment for home study. Their access to the internet, computers may still be limited. There'll be a lot of disruptions, often quite potentially one quite large family in very few rooms. And our experience is that even when families do move on to permanent accommodation, they may still be struggling with some of these issues: access to the internet, overcrowding. And then I think the second issue would be lack of parental support and engagement. So that would sort of play into support with homework. Now, this is likely not out of reluctance from the parents. It's not that they don't want to support their children's education or that they don't value it, but because of the parents' own challenges with settling into this country, with language, having to look after other children, and then dealing with their own feelings of trauma and dislocation. So in this context, something even as simple as reading a child's flashcards, phonetic flashcards, or a reading book may well not happen. And then another thing is to bear in mind is possible poverty as a sort of key, obvious sort of underlying issue. And that may affect the children in terms of even nutrition, what they're eating, the ability to buy uniforms and equipment, and as time goes on, maybe even extracurricular activities. And that all contributes to potentially making the learning experience and the academic progress of these children particularly challenging. So I'm now going to move on to our third and final outcome. So we've kind of heard all about the problems, but let's think now about how do we develop compassionate and effective strategies and interventions. And I think I want to say at the outset, there is no one size fits all. So please do, as you listen to me talking, take time to consider how this might work in your environment, in your school. Okay, so again, drawing on our research and our experience, what we would say The key principles that you should take into consideration when you're engaging with refugee children are as follows. And the first one is, I suppose, incredibly obvious. And I know that as a teacher, you will aim to build trust and have patience with all of your children and their families. But I think it's really worth particularly bearing in mind with refugee children, as it may well take much longer than you're used to. But I think as a teacher, you have a unique opportunity to set an example of welcome and really holistic care, both for the children and for their parents, making them feel both seen and listened to and welcome in this country. I think the second thing is, I am sure, in line with all of your behaviour policies, but particularly when you're dealing with really challenging behaviour, it's really worth reminding ourselves to look beyond the behaviour to what might be causing it. And seeking to address it where you can in collaboration with other staff, bearing in mind all the stuff we talked about previously, the trauma that these children will have experienced. Now, of course, many of these children, particularly if they come with little or no English, are going to struggle enormously at the beginning, whatever level of school they're starting at. But again, this seems obvious, but please remember that low language ability is not synonymous with low intelligence. Many of these children will be academically very, very gifted. And what we do often find is that a lack of language ability is sort of means that people sort of ignore an ability, for example, in music or in maths, and sort of assume that is across the field. And so, fourthly, and I think this is probably one of my favourites, although I also recognise that at times this feels like the hardest one, try to see a refugee child, or maybe multiple refugee children's presence in your classroom as an opportunity for the other children, and indeed for the staff, to learn more about compassion and to widen their worldview, rather than as a burden, as a problem. And I mean, I speak as a parent of a 5-year-old in year 1 in an inner city London school with many refugee families. And for sure, my son has witnessed and knows that many children start without language, and he's definitely sort of witnessed some behaviour from other children, which is, you know, not in line with the behaviour policies at his school. But he's also seen that those children learn English really quickly, and that children really quickly learn what is expected of them and what's not. And actually for us as a family, it's led in some fascinating conversations about sort of world geography and culture, and we've looked at maps together. And I can genuinely say that in my family and in the school my son goes to, that it is really seen as a positive thing to have those families in our midst. And I also want to reference the head of a local secondary school in our area, which has a huge number of refugee children. And when we spoke to him, he said that enrolling these refugee children was the single most effective thing for raising aspirations among his entire student body. So, on paper, these principles may feel really straightforward, but we really recognise that they will look different in different schools and different classrooms, and that for you all in your different roles, you might adopt them in different ways. So before we move on, I would just like to take 30 seconds to stop and for you to reflect on how you might put these principles into practice in your own environment.
Katie? I know you will answer questions later, but I think this one is very pertinent to answer as you come back.
Yeah.
One of our participants asks, can you clarify or develop what you mean by an assets-based approach?
Yeah, of course. What that's about really is just seeing refugee children as an asset to your school. That I think, you know, a significant portion of this training is looking at the challenges, and there are significant challenges. And I know that if a school knows that there are a number of refugee children starting, often we see the problems and the challenges and the lack of resources and how difficult it will be. And I don't want to shy away from those. Those are real. But I also want schools to recognise that refugee children can be a huge asset. That as the local secondary school head teacher said, you know, it was the single most important thing for raising aspirations among his entire student body. But also, I think having children from a different culture, speaking a different language, coming into your school really helps to build compassion and a wider perspective amongst the students, from very little ones actually right the way through to sixth formers. Does that answer your question? Okay, well, moving on. So approaches for teachers. When responding to the fight or flight response, a couple of useful pointers are: make sure that you move slowly and calmly and speak in a gentle voice. So it's really important to create a safe space for the child. Perhaps you could consider calmly moving away from other children in the room. You know, you could go outside, get some fresh air. Simple actions, you know, remember that their nervous system is being flooded with adrenaline, that the thinking part of their brain is being switched off, so anything complex isn't going to get through. Give them a really simple task to do. Can they, I don't know, sort through the pencils for you? Give them a glass of water. And I think the other thing to recognise is awareness of sensitive topics, and that how seemingly normal topics may be triggers for refugee children. And in raising these, I'm not saying that you don't have to talk about them, but just to go into these discussions being aware that they may be triggers. So things like asking after family, asking about Afghanistan, about their journey to the UK, all of those things might be very, very difficult. And I think it's particularly important, as particularly this topic of family, it's a very normal one, isn't it? It's sort of a bit of a small talk sort of topic. Tell us about your family, or you might be asking children. But if we're dealing with people who potentially have left close family members behind and they're very worried about them and missing them a lot, that might in and of itself be a trigger. I think having time to talk can be a really, really important part of creating a safe space. So you're going to play such an important role in helping children adjust to their new environments. You may find that if they have experienced significant stress and trauma, that they open up to you unexpectedly. And as I know you'll all know from your safeguarding work, it's so important that they feel listened to and valued at this point. But of course, it's also important that you balance the needs of the other children in your class and also all the other stuff that you have to do. So if you feel comfortable listening to the child for a time, you know, make sure that you move to a quiet place. But if you don't have the time, or there isn't an appropriate space, make sure that you can direct the child to an agency, whether that's in the school or out of it, where the child can safely talk. And I think it's again, I'm sure bread and butter to many of you, but it's always a good idea to share your concerns with your school's safeguarding coordinator if something comes up and children are disclosing something to you, whether or not you yourself are able or have the time to sit with them and really listen to what it is that they want to share. So now we're going to look at some practical interventions supporting children. So here we go. The first thing I'd like you to consider is peer support interventions. So our research shows that creative approaches such as buddy schemes can make a really, really big difference to refugee children's abilities to settle in. So, for example, could you match an Afghan student with another student, the same sex, ideally, given what we've spoken about how education in Afghanistan is quite often separated by sex. Could they be from a similar language or cultural background if that's possible? But I think even more importantly, make sure you match them with a child who is welcoming, who has the right attitude. And you know, those buddies could just do really simple things like show them around the school, introduce them to their friends in the playground, you know, get them involved in a game of football or whatever they're playing. Talk to them about their classroom and the expectations. And there are key things that you can do to help children with their adjustment to a new school environment. I think it's worth remembering that some of the school rules or customs that may seem basic are likely to be unfamiliar for some of these children. So, for example, take the time to explain what their timetable is, their uniform, their kit, registers. What's a register? How does that work? Breaks, lunchtime, and also set the expectation of key behaviours in the classroom. I know this is sometimes very difficult, but to promote stability, which is particularly important given everything that these children have been through, make every effort that you can to minimise teacher changes or classroom changes, and keep the parents and keep the children informed about upcoming events or activities at school. Pastoral care. So strong, again, it's fairly straightforward, but so important. Strong pastoral care and wellbeing support is crucial. Make sure that the children know who they turn to if there's a problem. Linking children up with the right internal support. So is there a school counsellor? Is there a therapist there? Are there specific wellbeing staff? That they know who they are, ideally that they're already introduced to them so that it's easier for them to go to them if there's a problem. And if you don't think that there is anyone who is able to do that function as you would wish at school, maybe there's something outside of school, external support that you might be able to sort of link the child up with. So everything that we've mentioned will help make your school a more welcoming and inclusive places, but there are other things you can do to sort of promote that sense of inclusion and welcome. So, for example, bear in mind their cultural and religious needs. So halal food is very important. Religious holidays, so Islamic holidays, when are they? Bear in mind that the children may well want a day off school for those. Can you make sure that there are visible signs celebrating diversity in your school? I don't know, for example, sort of welcome boards saying hello in various languages, particularly in Pashto and Dari, which are the languages of Afghanistan. Take your time to learn how to pronounce the children's names accurately. And these are really small examples of welcome, but I think when we speak to children, they go a really long way. And we've already mentioned language, and this is a key pillar of welcome and support for refugee children's education. And language support is always going to be crucial. So make the most of the resources that are already available. Have a look at the Bell Foundation's resources, which are absolutely fantastic, and also NALDIC. There's lots of advice sheets, ideas for creative language interventions for EAL students. Could you consider setting up a lunchtime or after school language support for children? Could you ask parents of the children at your school if they would be willing to come in and volunteer as a reading buddy or something like that? Are there ways of accessing additional Pashto and Dari speakers to help children within your classrooms? And I think particularly if your school is taking children from a hotel, if you have a hotel locally, there are likely to be many, many adults in that hotel who, and many of them may speak English well as Pashto and Dari, could they not come in and volunteer and sort of help with the transition? And then extra academic support. So, for example, we run at REUK, we run a mentoring project. It's not entirely national. We run it in London, we run it in the West Midlands, we run it in the east of England and in Oxford. And that's for slightly older children, so for 14 plus. And what we do is we match young people with a community volunteer who will meet with them for an hour a week to help them with their homework. But there are lots of other organisations out there who run similar support programs. Can you link your children up with something like that? And then I think it's also crucial to remember the parents. They obviously will play a significant role in their children successfully integrating and learning, learning in an English UK school environment. And it's really important that they receive support as well. So firstly, with language, can you consider using interpreters for key meetings such as parents' evenings? I know this would come with a cost, but maybe you, as we've mentioned, you already know families that are Pashto or Dari speakers, and also someone speaks good English, could come in and volunteer for you to offer that support. Having Google Translate, having it available on a tablet if you're meeting with parents and you're not able to get that additional translation, or maybe it's not appropriate for the sort of meeting you're doing, make sure you have Google Translate lined up and ready to go. Can you translate newsletters and messages to families into the community languages? All of these things are going to make a huge difference to how engaged the parents of your refugee children will be, and how much they will feel that the school sees them, values them, wants them to be part of the school community. As with many parts of the British education system, it's all going to be new for these Afghan families as well as for the children. And it's important to try and think of sort of strategies and interventions that are really going to help the families adjust. So, for example, we would highly recommend organising tours of the school for the families. Again, try and make sure that you've got language support available for that. So you're translating into the languages that these families are likely to speak. And it's really, I think, important to put into practice those principles of trying to build trust and have patience, sort of plan in sufficient time for discussions with parents and for building those positive and supportive relationships with them. And some things that, if we think right back to the beginning of this presentation, talking about education in Afghanistan, there are going to be things that will probably be unfamiliar to the families, such as maybe the length of the school day, or the fact that education is compulsory in the UK and you have to send your child to school every day, unless, of course, it's an authorised absence. These may genuinely not be familiar to the families of the Afghan refugees that will be starting in your schools. So you're setting yourself and them up for success if you are setting out those expectations really clearly at the beginning with translation, but also having the sympathy and understanding that is not necessarily the educational background they have come from. Another important aspect for helping families to adjust is building in space and time for social activities, helping refugee families sort of feel part of the community. And again, I realise that this won't be possible for every school, but could you run weekend trips or activities for the new families? Do you have a mother and toddler group? Is that something that you could link them up with, even if you're not running it? Or simply, can you connect the families of the new Afghan refugees to families that you know in your school that are welcoming, that will help them? In a similar way, I suppose, we were talking about buddy schemes for the children. Can you think about doing something else, formally or informally, for some of the parents? Moving on now to the technology support. could you consider providing advice and support for parents around technology? Don't assume that the parents will be familiar with the various platforms that you are likely to use to communicate with families. I think, you know, speaking personally, as a sort of English-speaking British mother, you know, with a university education, I find it hugely challenging to navigate the various platforms that I'm supposed to engage with and to remember when he comes in his own clothes and all the rest of it. So how much more difficult is it going to be for a family that doesn't have any expectation that that is the way that a school will operate, is not able to navigate the technical platforms, and if they do, is not going to necessarily understand the messages in English. So could you, for example, run a session where you're helping families to walk through the different platforms, really providing quite basic support? How do you log on? How do you navigate it? Letting, you know, your teachers know, or whoever it is, that they might have to sort of consistently be checking with parents. Are you looking at this? Are you aware of this? Are you aware that tomorrow we're expecting this form to come back, or whatever it might be? I think finally, while we've suggested lots of things that you as a school could help to do refugee families, please don't feel that all of the responsibility rests entirely on you as a school. There are highly likely to be other community organisations and services that will be invaluable, both for the children and their families, but maybe also for you and the school staff. So at the end, I think we've linked some other organisations, and we can, I was about to say we can put them in the chat. I'm not 100% sure the chat's working, but we can certainly share them after as well. So do flag these other support mechanisms, support organisations to your families. I think as we draw to a close, I'd also want to highlight to particularly those of you who are working face to face with young refugees and their families to remember self-care. I think working with refugee children, particularly those who have been through very traumatic experiences and may really be struggling, is often really emotionally draining. And as a teacher or a support worker, you are very likely to have a limited capacity and already be feeling like you're quite stressed. You've got so many things that you're juggling and trying to do. And I just want to say, sort of, vicarious trauma is a real thing. So please do, I hope this doesn't sound patronizing, but I need to remember it myself as well. Please do prioritize the things that mean that you will look after yourself and will help with your own well-being. And if you need to, do recognize those warning signs of when you're really struggling with some of this vicarious trauma, and maybe even speak to someone in a professional capacity. So just gonna sort of finish by talking about some of the further information or training that we can provide as Refugee Education UK. So what we've got here is links, and I think they'll be shared in the chat as well, links to our training. We run extensive training, and we'd welcome any of you to come to our training. Also resources. So we have resources in Dari and Pashto, and we're in the process of creating a lot more. In Dari, in Pashto, actually in Ukrainian as well. Some of them will be practitioner facing, so advice for teachers and for other practitioners, and some of them will be young person facing. So yeah, resources that you can show to the young people that you're working with. We also have hello at REUK if you've got a general inquiry, and the welcome team is our newly set up team for newly arrived refugees, with a focus particularly on Afghans and Ukrainians. And then I'd really encourage you to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or particularly, actually, I'd encourage you to sign up to our newsletter. And I'm not just saying that because we're trying to get everyone to sign up to our newsletter, but because we are constantly producing more resources. And so if you sign up to our newsletter, you will always be updated about when we have those resources available that may be useful to you and to your colleagues and to the students that you work with. So thank you. I think I am pretty much on 40 minutes, maybe run over a few minutes, but
amazing, fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie, for such an insightful and informative presentation. And now we're going to move on to the Q&A, question and answer part of the webinar, and we welcome Hamid and Hassan. And we've got quite a few questions for you. And before I ask the questions, I just wanted to let you know that participants have got lots of brilliant ideas and comments, so it's really great. Thank you, and keep those coming. So the first question from Suzanne, she says that she has had some Afghan children come to her school with no previous schooling. Is there any advice as to where to start that you could give? For example, a child of 10 starting with no schooling previously. Maybe that's for you, Katie, but feel free to answer, whoever you feel want to add on or answer the question.
Oh gosh, it's so difficult, isn't it? And I think I will try and answer your specific question, but I think it's a really useful reminder that when it's not to make assumptions. So the Afghan children that will be starting at your schools, I suspect you will have the full gamut from some of them who've done really extensive education. And, it's what we're saying about please don't assume that low language ability correlates with a sort of low academic ability or low intellect. And then you will have others for whom actually, I'm not saying have a low intellect, absolutely not, but for whom they don't have that educational history in Afghanistan. I mean, I think I'm really interested in what other people think as well. For me, I would say it's a lot to do with classroom study skills. So you're probably going to find that there are challenges around concentration and around actually learning. So if you think back to British schools, we start children with much more play and gradually get them into you sit and you concentrate for longer. So I would suspect that a 10-year-old arriving with not much previous education would need a lot of grace about concentration and ability to focus. And I think my top tips would be to see what they're interested in. What are their interests, and sort of go in that way. And I would also say focus on English and maths, and I think this would be my sort of top tip all the way through school is focus on the English and maths, and when you have a better level of English, maybe expand the curriculum a bit. Hamid, or Hassan actually, but would you have anything to add to that?
Thank you, Katie. I believe every child is coming with some previous background and knowledge. Probably if there are some students or asylum seekers or refugee people, definitely there were lots of problems back in Afghanistan where they could not benefit from proper education. But I'm sure they have that inbuilt in nature or capability to continue education in United Kingdom, which is more systematic, and probably they just need more support and enhancement with their attempts for education. I believe if they are given more focus on language, on English language, and as you said, probably focus on science subjects, where in future those courses, those subjects will help him to open the gateways for further education or for higher education. That will help them a lot. But the most common barriers for those Afghan students with no proper education would be English and math. And they definitely need a lot of focus and attention on those areas, and that can be provided as like extra classes, probably provided, or some sorts of mentoring programs provided by different organization or charity offices.
Thank you, Hassan. And as I have you there, I'll ask you the next question. So this is a question from Rob, and it's got two parts. So the first question is, would we expect a majority of any specific language, for example, Pashto, Dari, Uzbek? And the second part is, would there be strife between students coming from different regions of the country?
Very good question. I'm going to hand over to my Afghan colleagues. So Hamid, would you expect there to be more Pashto or more Dari speakers?
Yes, I think both languages, Pashto and Daris, are almost very common in Afghanistan. So I believe there will be almost equal portion of both language spoken refugees here, refugees children, yeah.
Can I add something here? Coming to the recent horrific situations happen in Afghanistan, I believe the majority of students with Pashto speaking background, unfortunately, they have been sorts of deprived from education in Afghanistan region-wise, because those areas were mainly occupied by the Taliban forces, where education was not properly acted and enforced. That's why majority of the schools were burned down to ashes, and also people, students were actually threatened to not attend schools, and probably this can add up to the large number of Pashto speaking students who were unfortunately deprived from the rights of education in Afghanistan.
So
thank you. Yes, sorry, Katie.
I was just interested in whether you guys thought that there would likely be tension between different, if that's something that schools should anticipate, that there would be tension between different groups of people, or you don't expect that to be an issue?
Tension in what matters, Katie?
I think that the person who's asking, if I understood the question right, wondered if sort of people who spoke different languages or came from different sort of ethnic backgrounds within Afghanistan would be likely to sort of bring those, would be something that the schools should think about in the UK. Am I understanding the question right?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
I don't think if there will be like any issues with that, but probably, as I said earlier, the focus should be more on those students who has no proper education background, and that majority of them come from the areas where Taliban were residing, and schools were either banned or not allowed for the people to attend.
Okay, thank you. A question from Mark, and I think this one I would like Hamid to answer from the perspective of having been in education here in the UK. So he says, what are your thoughts on using Pashto or Dari as part of EAL support in the classroom?
Can you maybe simplify that one a bit more?
It's about, you know, for example, teaching assistants or teachers using, rather than English only, using Pashto or Dari as part of the support that the children receive in classes, and probably also with homework.
I'm not sure if that will be a good idea, because that will, you know, delay their improvement in English language. When I was here in FE college, we had some teachers who are actually speaking Arabic, and my classmates, they were speaking Arabic, so they were always communicating in Arabic. And they actually sometimes trying to complain to me like, oh, our teacher is Arabic and we always speak Arabic and we don't improve that, you know, basic skill that we need to communicate and move forward in our English language. So I don't think that will be very necessary in terms of teaching.
I think I can see sort of one of the comments. I think if it's used well, I totally agree with Hamid's point that, but I think if it's used well, then it can be a really, really helpful sort of first step of when a child speaks no English to sort of translate keywords. I think that can be really useful. But I also do really take your point, Hamid, that if people just rely on it having everything translated, it hinders their language acquisition.
Thank you. And I think it's interesting that to define when you said when it is used well. And at the Bell Foundation, we have lots of support, guidance, training, and resources to unpack that. So how can we use all the languages that the pupils know to help and to facilitate and to be a resource and an asset as children learn and acquire English, but also to maintain their languages, you know, because it's a language of the family, and they might want to go back to Afghanistan or re-engage with the Afghan system. So we will put some links to give you information about how that using well, you know, what that means. Thank you. Okay, over to the next question. Is there specific help available for Afghan children that may have SEND, special educational needs issues? Who would like to take that?
I mean, I'll take it, but it's a slightly depressing picture, I'm afraid. The answer is no, as far as I'm aware. And again, I'm really interested if anyone has any other information. But it's as I think people know, there's a huge issue nationally, not just with refugee children, at identifying and addressing sort of special educational needs, and those are particularly difficult to diagnose when children also have experienced trauma and maybe sort of acting out some of that, and English and don't speak English. So I'm not aware, and certainly when this is for older students, but we've worked a lot with universities to try and get sort of really culturally specific sort of therapies, and it's just so hard to access. So I'm afraid it's a bit of a depressing picture in this instance. I mean, I think my advice would be, if this is something that you're really finding as an acute need in your school, is maybe to go back to the local authorities and raise it with them. But it's not a very hopeful picture.
Thank you. A question from Georgina. She wants to know whether Afghan resettlement students come with additional funding, and do parents have support workers like those from Syrian resettlement?
So it's a slightly different model. So the local authority has been given a sort of a lump sum for every individual, but how they spend it is kind of up to them, really. I'm quite interested from sort of the schools that we have available, whether they found that that's sort of translated into resources for them, and how they've used that.
Actually, one of the participants says that in their school they're teaching parents English.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, you know, I find examples like that so incredibly encouraging.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Rob. He says, it's a very concrete question. I use a lot of affect imagery for my students. For example, my Ukrainian refugees love to see sunflowers. My Indian students love to see my statue of Ganesha. What are some icons that Afghan students would find comforting? So maybe Ehsan or Hamid, do you have any ideas?
Thank you. I believe there are many cultural and traditional things that Afghan students would love to see, and just make them feel comfortable with that. Probably the picture of Afghanistan flag, not the current flag, but the previous flag. Maybe the pictures of some of the historical places in Afghanistan, like Dar al-Aman Palace, like the Bamiyan Buddha statues, and also some of the other historical places, you know, around the country. Those things and plus some of the typical and historical sports like buzkashi, and also typical Afghan foods and dishes. Those are the things I think can help students feel like more welcome and comfortable.
Thank you, Ehsan. It would be amazing if you can type those proper names so that we know exactly how to spell it and look them up in Google. Thank you. In the meantime, Hamid, would you like to add anything about that?
I think Ehsan mentioned all the important ones, especially the flag. I think Afghan kids love that one, as Ehsan said, not the new one, the old one. And Afghan foods, of course, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. A question from Catherine. How is the use of specific and additional educational funding for resettled Afghan pupils monitored for impact? Katie?
I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to pass on this one. The funding model is not my area of expertise, but I would love to know the answer to that. Is anyone aware of that?
Not really. Not that I'm aware. Caroline, if you have something to add, please feel free. Thank you. And possibly, we're running out of time for questions. So that was the last question. So thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the webinar. But before we finish, can I just let you know of some of the other training opportunities that we have coming up? You have seen already the links for training from Refugee Education UK. I'm now going to add a couple that are quite relevant in terms of both training and resources from the Bell Foundation. So I wanted to point to some guidance that we have, which is called Welcoming Refugee and Asylum-Seeking Learners, which has lots of resources for schools welcoming newly arrived learners who speak English as an additional language. The link is there, but we will also provide it tomorrow when we upload our video. It's really useful information about the English education system, and this is particularly important if you think about, year 6 students visiting secondary schools is particularly interesting for that transition. Equally, just to point out that this guidance has also been translated to Dari and Pashto so that parents can also read it and understand it. Our next important, I would say, a piece of information or guidance is that we have, if you like, a back catalogue of previous webinars on the topic of welcoming refugee children into the UK education system. So we have the first one that we had was called Welcoming Refugee Children. It's there on the screen as number 7, Advice and Guidance for Schools. That was led by REUK's Chief Executive, and that is Catherine Gladwell. So that was a really interesting and insightful introduction. We then had a panel webinar, that's your number 4, the second on the screen, the central role of language in supporting new refugee arrivals. And as I said, a number of speakers from REUK, from the Education Policy Institute, etc., participated with, again, very insightful. Also, how to welcome Ukrainian arrivals in UK schools. That was led by the head teacher of a supplementary school from Ukraine. Also very useful, very practical, very insightful. And then 2 sessions on how to support new refugee arrivals in the inclusive classroom. So a primary version or a secondary version. So please make sure you check our website, particularly the webinars page, which is packed with useful insights. In terms of forthcoming courses, we have 2 3-hour online courses coming up soon. The first one beginning on the 4th of November and lasting 4 weeks, 3 hours over 4 weeks, so that you can, complete the course in your own time, at your own pace, and you've got plenty of time to work on it. How to adapt teaching for learners who use English as an additional language. This is a course for school staff who want guidance on adapting teaching in a responsive way to meet the language development needs of your pupils who use EAL. And then on the 17th of January next year, we've got a course on EAL assessment. So it's called An Introduction to EAL Assessment. And again, this is for school staff who want to be better able to assess the English language proficiency of multilingual pupils who use English as an additional language. So finally, a quick reminder that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar, and that when you leave the webinar, a post-course evaluation form will appear. You will also get a link to the same form in the email tomorrow, and we would really be grateful if you could spend a few moments to complete it, as your views will really help us shape our future program. Thank you so much for taking part in today's webinar, and special thanks to you, Katie, Hamid, and Ehsan. Tremendously inspiring and encouraging. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you from us at the Bell Foundation, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.